Welcome back to my channel. Hope you all are fine. Tell us in the comments from where you are watching our video. Let's start with another day of aviation miracle. The sky that morning was a quiet shade of silver blue, the kind of light that makes everything seem peaceful, predictable, and safe. Flight 279 had just leveled off at 30,000 feet. Beneath it, the world stretched endlessly, a blanket of clouds glowing gold beneath the rising sun. Inside the cockpit, routine filled the air, 1,000 procedures done perfectly, 1,000 things that could go wrong, but hadn't yet. In the cabin, passengers leaned back with sleepy smiles, trays half opened, headphones on, minds adrift between destinations. The engines hummed their steady lullaby, that deep, confident tone that tells you everything is fine. But somewhere, hidden behind that hum, a different rhythm had begun, a subtle vibration, so faint it could easily be mistaken for turbulence. A small change in tone, unnoticed by everyone except the instruments that never sleep. The aircraft's sensors began, recording a slight imbalance in the left engine's pressure. Nothing alarming, just numbers shifting on a digital display, a slight flicker on an engine status screen. For now, the plane remained steady. The pilots exchanged routine checks, unaware that the data scrolling silently. In front of them was the first whisper of something that would soon grip every soul on board. Outside, the wind picked up. Thin streams of cirrus clouds streaked across the horizon as if racing toward some invisible finish line. The air temperature dropped sharply, and inside the jets, engines, a small sequence of events was aligning perfectly, almost mathematically, for failure. Fuel flow, compressor blades, temperature surge, three variables that under normal conditions create thrust. But in the thin, cold air above the clouds, a microscopic fragment of ice slipped past the filters, melting only partially. It wasn't enough to cause damage, not yet, but it was enough to begin a chain reaction that would test every ounce of training, calm, and courage in that cockpit. At this moment, the flight data recorder, the black box, was already capturing the first clues. To an untrained ear, it was just a hum. But to experts, replayed later, it would sound like a heartbeat-changing pace. Passengers continued sipping coffee. One man opened a newspaper. A child pressed her face against the window, tracing the wingtip through the morning mist. None of them could know that 30 minutes from now, that same wing would shudder violently as alarms filled the cockpit. High above the clouds, Flight 279 was entering a corridor of unstable air. The radar showed scattered weather ahead, nothing severe, just light storm cells forming over the Atlantic. It was routine for the pilots. They adjusted their course slightly, setting the autopilot to steer clear. A quiet sigh, a glance between them. Normal skies again, yet in that same moment, the left engine temperature spiked for a fraction of a second, then dropped. A pulse of heat and pressure. The onboard computer detected it, logged it, and continued. But within that spike, a small component of a turbine blade had just endured stress it wasn't designed for. A tiny crack, invisible to the eye, had begun to form. This was the moment. Before chaos, the invisible, line between comfort and catastrophe as the aircraft glided onward. The world below shifted from sea to cloud to sky, sky to nothing. At 30,000 feet, silence has its own sound, the deep, steady hum of order. And when that order breaks, it doesn't begin with a bang. It begins with a whisper. Somewhere in the cabin, a flight attendant checked the galley temperature. Another adjusted a passenger's seatbelt. They were small gestures of calm, unaware of how close they were to history. Because soon every action, every look, every breath would matter. The plane's transponder pinged a nearby control center. Controllers marked its progress, a tiny moving dot among dozens. Nothing unusual. No sign of distress, just another flight cruising through thin air, on schedule, on time. And yet, those same controllers would later recall the exact moment. That dot began to tremble. The clock in the cockpit ticked past. 08:23. The pilots made another systems check, hydraulics, fuel, altitude. Everything in the green. A perfect flight. They didn't notice the faint vibration deep in the airframe, or the subtle change in the frequency of the engine's sound. It was too soft, too buried under the hum of airflow and electronics. But machines notice. Sensors notice. The plane's monitoring systems had already sent two. Internal warnings and minor irregularities logged silently for review. Nothing required immediate action. Nothing yet. Then, at 0829, the first audible clue arrived. A short, sharp pop sound, not loud enough to alarm the passengers, but just enough to make the captain glance at the engine panel. Everything still read normal. He noted it mentally, continued the checklist, and pressed on. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. A layer of storm cloud ahead reflected the morning light in strange colors: greenish, silver, bruised blue. The weather radar flickered again. They could bypass it easily, but it meant entering an area of colder air, where ice formation was more likely. The captain adjusted course. The plane responded smoothly. The autopilot trimmed the ailerons, adjusted thrust. Perfect response. Perfect control. And yet, every perfect response was hiding a growing imperfection. Deep inside the left engine, where heat met metal and metal began to weaken. Down below in the control tower, an air traffic controller noted the flight's progress with calm precision. Dozens of flights, dozens of voices, all routine. But in the next hour, one voice would rise above them all, shaky, urgent, calling the word that freezes every frequency in aviation: Mayday. For now, though, the world was still at peace. The engines roared softly. The passengers dreamed quietly. And the aircraft strong, confident, beautiful carried on, unaware that its calm blue sky was about to break open. It began with a vibration, faint, uneven, almost hesitant. At first, it was so small that it could easily have been mistaken for turbulence, the kind that makes coffee ripple gently in paper cups, the kind no one remembers after landing. But this one was different. It carried a rhythm, a pulse, something mechanical, alive and failing. The aircraft sliced through thin air, 30,000 feet above a restless ocean. The storm system that had seemed distant now loomed ahead, spreading its gray arms across the horizon. Inside, the passengers felt only a slight change in motion, a shift so subtle it might have been a trick of the mind. But in the cockpit, the instruments had already started whispering warnings. Tiny numbers flickered on screens, pressure drops, temperature spikes, unbalanced thrust readings. The left engine was struggling. Within seconds, the imbalance grew sharper. The engine's internal components began to tremble under abnormal stress. The turbine blade that had cracked earlier, invisible, microscopic, now tore just a fraction more, releasing a vibration that spread through the entire nacelle like an echo trapped inside metal. To the pilots, the sound reached their bones before their ears, a low, humming tremor that didn't belong, a sense that the machine they trusted was changing tone. Outside, the clouds began to darken. The sky took on a strange, bruised glow, the color that precedes lightning. Moisture began to coat the windshield, each droplet turning to streaks of silver in the thin air. The autopilot adjusted pitch automatically, the aircraft compensating for shifting wind currents. And then it happened, a deep metallic thud, followed by a sudden drop in thrust. The left engine's roar turned into a guttural groan, then silence. The instruments flashed red. One engine had just failed. The sound inside the cabin changed instantly. Passengers might not have known why, but they felt it. The shift from smooth power to uneven drag. A subtle tilt, a trembling of the floor. The hum that had been constant since takeoff was now broken, unsteady. Some looked around instinctively. Others tightened seatbelts. A mother reached for her child's hand. In the cockpit, chaos found its order. Warning lights glowed, alarms pulsed in rhythm, and a calm urgency took over. The pilot's hands moved swiftly, their training flowing like muscle memory. Every motion deliberate, practiced, essential. Outside, the wind grew louder, battering the aircraft. Clouds thickened, swallowing the jet in gray. The horizon disappeared completely. No sky, no sea, only motion and instinct. The right engine still held steady, carrying the full weight of flight now. It was enough to keep them airborne, but just barely. The crew began a series of critical checks, isolating fuel lines, balancing thrust, recalculating altitude. The left engine, once the powerhouse, now spun uselessly in the wind, a dead weight on the wing. Within minutes, air traffic control noticed a deviation, a slight drop in altitude. A wobble in speed. The radar trace flickered. Controllers leaned forward, unsure if it was a technical glitch or the start of something serious. Their screens showed nothing more than a dot shifting in a sea of data. But behind that dot, a story of survival had just begun. The clouds outside had grown violent. Streaks of lightning flared nearby, casting sharp white light across the fuselage. Every flash illuminated faces frozen between confusion and calm. The flight attendants, still composed, moved with quiet precision, closing overhead bins, checking seatbelts, hiding their own fear behind professionalism. Meanwhile, inside the engine, metal met fire in its final argument. Fragments began to dislodge, spinning at impossible speed. The computer systems detected it. Instantly, the engine's temperature rising beyond threshold, airflow collapsing. Seconds later, the pressure dropped completely. The aircraft shuddered once more as if it took a deep breath and held it. Then came the smoke. A faint gray haze, almost invisible at first, began trailing from the left wing. It twisted in the cold air, fragile yet terrifyingly real. In the cockpit, the crew isolated the source, a contained engine failure. Fire suppression activated automatically, releasing a burst of cold gas through the ducts. Outside, the smoke thinned. But the damage was done. They had lost one engine. The aircraft could still fly, but the balance of flight was delicate now. Every move had to be perfect. The captain disengaged autopilot, taking manual control. The yoke felt heavier than before, the response slower. The sound of wind against metal grew louder, sharper, more alive. The plane descended slightly, steady but strained. Down below, in the control center, an operator picked up the first transmission, short, clipped, professional. The kind of message that begins calm, but carries weight in every syllable. It wasn't Mayday yet, not officially, but it was the kind of transmission that makes every controller lean forward, fingers hovering over the response channel. Back in the sky, the pilots scanned their instruments again. The right engine was steady, hydraulics stable, cabin pressure holding, but something else caught their attention, a drop in electrical current. The left generator, powered by the failed engine, had gone offline. That meant reduced systems, less redundancy, and no room for another failure. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the change in the air pressure. The lights flickered once. The intercom remained silent, but silence itself said enough. Fear moves fast in enclosed spaces. It spreads in eyes and breath, in the grip of armrests, in the quick glances toward windows. The storm outside intensified. The aircraft shivered in turbulence, flashes of lightning painting its fuselage in cold white light. Each flash revealed the scars of strain, tiny ripples across the wing, rivets flexing under pressure, the faint trail of smoke still clinging to the sky behind. And then, as the aircraft fought its invisible battle, something extraordinary happened. The sound of a distant voice crackled through the radio. Air traffic? Control requesting confirmation. The response was calm, clipped, composed. From that moment, the world would know Flight 279 was in trouble. The first official emergency code was entered. Transponders updated, and as the controller's console lit up with the words, "Priority! Emergency!" a silence fell across every frequency in the sector. Above the storm, the jet continued forward, one engine dead, one heart still beating. Inside, fear moved quietly among the passengers. Some prayed. Some closed their eyes. Most simply waited, trusting the unseen hands guiding them through the storm. And in that fragile corridor of air, suspended between life and disaster, Flight 279 became more than a flight number. It became a test of endurance, a testament to training, and the beginning of a story that would echo through every pilot's mind for years to come. The calm was gone now. The sky had changed its voice, and for the first time, the world below would soon hear it. Through the crackling radio waves that carried the word Mayday. The sky was no longer blue. It had turned into a churning ocean of gray and silver, each cloud folding into the next like waves swallowing light. The aircraft was inside the storm. Now, its engines echoing through an invisible battlefield of wind and water, every second felt heavier than the last. Inside the cockpit, time itself began to stretch. Each sound, every alarm, every vibration seemed amplified, alive. The red glow of warning lights painted the pilots' faces in tones of urgency. Beneath the rhythmic blare of alerts, a new voice entered the airwaves, calm, focused, carrying the weight of thousands of hours of training. The word Mayday finally echoed across the radio. It was short, sharp, absolute. A signal that cut through every channel, every conversation, every layer of static. And with that one word, Flight 279 was no longer routine. It was priority. Far below, in a quiet control tower miles away, the radar operators leaned in. The dot representing Flight 279 flashed red. Emergency declared. Controllers cleared the airspace immediately. Every other aircraft in the region was rerouted. The sky itself now belonged to this one wounded jet, limping through the storm. Back in the cockpit, the crew began the emergency descent checklist. One engine down meant reduced power, reduced altitude margin, and reduced time. The co-pilot monitored instruments while the captain fought the yoke. Countering asymmetric thrust, one wing pulling hard, the other lagging behind. The aircraft rolled slightly to the left. The captain corrected. Another gust hit. The plane shuddered violently, the entire frame creaking under the stress of wind shear. The rain outside turned into sheets, hammering against the windshield like thrown stones. Lightning flickered again, so close that it lit up the cockpit with a white flash brighter than the sun. For a heartbeat, the world outside disappeared into blinding light, then fell back into darkness. The passengers could feel it all. The tilt, the sudden drop, the way the engines no longer hummed in harmony. Some gasped. Others went silent. A few began to cry softly, their voices lost beneath the roar of wind. Fear had taken form, but so had courage. Quiet, invisible, holding them together. In the galley, flight attendants held onto the walls, trying to remain steady. They moved methodically, checking belts, comforting whoever they could, keeping panic from turning into chaos. Their eyes met for brief moments, silent exchanges of strength amid uncertainty. The captain steadied the aircraft again, muscles tense from the effort. He adjusted trim controls manually, balancing the aircraft on one working engine. Every movement had to be calculated. Too much rudder, and the wing could stall. Too little, and they'd lose lift. It was like walking a tightrope blindfolded through a storm. The captain followed the vectors carefully, trusting the unseen voices on the ground as his own instruments fought interference. The plane's altitude dropped through 20,000 feet, then 15,000. Still in storm. Still fighting. Inside the left engine, the fire had died, but the damage was severe. The nacelle's inner shell was scorched, the fan blades frozen in place. The right engine carried the entire burden, burning more fuel than normal, straining against crosswinds that tried to push the aircraft off course. The airspeed wavered dangerously. Too slow and they'd stall. Too fast, and the weakened airframe could tear apart in turbulence. Every number mattered now. The captain exhaled slowly, hands steady on the controls. Calm was the weapon. Panic was the enemy. Even at the edge of chaos, professionalism lived in silence. Back in the cabin, the oxygen masks hung ready, not deployed yet, but close. The emergency lights flickered once more as thunder rolled nearby. The passengers were no longer strangers. In that storm-lit cabin, they were one, bound by the same fragile thread of hope that stretched between survival and sky. Outside, lightning illuminated. The right wing and the only working engine glowing faintly against the black clouds. Raindrops turned to streaks of silver fire under the strobe light. The aircraft tilted once more, buffeted by wind, but held its course. In the tower, controllers spoke quickly, calm voices masked with urgency. Runway preparations began at the nearest diversion airport. Fire crews mobilized, ambulances lined up. They didn't know if Flight 279 could make it that far, but they had to prepare for the moment it did. Meanwhile, the pilots managed to stabilize the descent. Below 10,000 feet now, through layers of rain, through turbulence that refused to ease. The cabin pressure normalized. The altitude warnings fell silent. It wasn't victory yet, but it was control. The storm began to thin near the horizon. Faint light, gray and cold, began to show through the clouds. For the first time since the failure, the crew could see something beyond darkness. The captain leveled the wings. The yoke eased. The tremor in the air began to fade. Through the windshield, a sliver of coastline appeared between the clouds. Land. It was distant, barely visible, but it was there, the faint promise of ground, of safety, of home. In the cabin, the tension softened. A few passengers noticed the light returning, the shaking slowing down. The child who had cried earlier was now asleep against her mother's shoulder. The hum of the single engine still filled the cabin, but now it sounded steady, almost reassuring. The crew's faces remained focused. They knew what came next would be the hardest part, the approach. Landing a crippled aircraft on one engine, low on power through shifting wind, the world below began to take shape. Rivers, fields, the glint of a runway far in the distance. They weren't safe yet, but they were heading there. At 7,000 feet, the aircraft broke free of the clouds completely. The storm remained behind them, roaring, flashing, fading. Ahead, a narrow path of light led the way, and as the tower below prepared for impact, Flight 279 steadied its course, wounded, weary, but alive. The fight for control wasn't over, but for the first time, survival didn't feel like a dream anymore. It felt possible. The clouds finally began to thin, their roaring edges fading into soft streaks of gray. Flight 279 broke free into clearer skies, its wings trembling but steady. Below, the coastline stretched like a thin silver line between the sea and the horizon, a quiet promise of safety after endless chaos. The storm still rumbled behind them, flashing faintly in the distance, like a memory refusing to fade. But ahead the air was calm. The battered jet glided through it with silent determination, one engine roaring, the other lifeless, a wounded bird still finding its way home. Inside the cockpit, the alarms had quieted. The glowing red lights dimmed one by one, leaving behind the steady hum of the surviving systems. The captain's hands rested firm on the controls, guiding the aircraft toward the distant runway lights that shimmered, faintly through mist and rain. Every movement now was delicate, every second calculated. They were descending through 5,000 feet. The wind had weakened, but still carried sudden bursts of turbulence that rocked the airframe. The plane responded sluggishly, heavier than before, as if exhaustion itself had weight. Yet through every tremor it held on. In the cabin, the silence was different now. It wasn't fear anymore, but it was waiting. Passengers sat still, eyes closed or fixed on the small oval windows glowing with faint morning light. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others stared straight ahead, lost between disbelief and hope. A flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle, checking belts, securing loose items, whispering calm reassurance. Her uniform was damp from sweat and condensation, but her face carried the kind of peace that only comes from courage held too long. Outside, the clouds opened completely, revealing the world below. Patches of green fields, small rivers glinting like silver threads, and far in the distance, the faint stretch of concrete, where hundreds of emergency lights blinked in synchronized rhythm. The airport was ready. Fire trucks lined the runway. Ambulances waited along the tarmac, their red lights flashing faintly through the mist. Every rescuer below looked up at the same patch of sky, waiting for a sound, the low, uneven hum of an aircraft fighting gravity with one good engine and unbroken will. Inside the cockpit, the captain began final approach. Manual control only, no autopilot. The checklist was simple now: gear down, flaps extended, maintain speed, trust instinct. The yoke trembled under his hands, every vibration telling a story of metal pushed to its limit. At 2,000 feet, the runway came fully into view. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, glistening against the glass like melted stars. The aircraft banked gently, aligning with the approach lights. The captain steadied it with small corrections, left, right, center. The co-pilot monitored airspeed, calling out readings in calm, controlled rhythm. In the cabin, everyone held their breath. The faint whine of the working engine filled the silence like a heartbeat. Children clutched their parents. Strangers held hands. The world seemed to slow down. At 500 feet, the wind picked up again, a sudden crosswind from the storm's tail. The plane tilted slightly. The ground rushed closer. But the captain didn't flinch. A smooth correction, level wings. The nose lifted gently. The wheels touched the runway with a heavy thud, rubber screaming against wet concrete. A trail of mist exploded behind the plane as it sped down the strip, water spraying from the tires. For a moment it felt endless, the ground sliding by, the aircraft refusing to stop. But the brakes held. The reverse thrust engaged from the right engine only, struggling but holding firm. The plane slowed. The roar turned into a growl. then into silence. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. The world was perfectly still. Then, like a wave breaking, the silence shattered. Cries, gasps, and sobs filling the cabin. Some passengers laughed through tears. Others just stared ahead, hands trembling, realizing they were alive. In the cockpit, the captain finally exhaled, a breath he'd been holding since the engine failed. His gloves were damp, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. The co-pilot's hand rested briefly on the throttle, not as a gesture of work, but of relief. Outside, rescue crews raced toward the plane, lights flashing across the soaked runway. Steam rose from the tires, drifting into the cool morning air like the last breath of the storm. And then, contact. The doors opened. The first touch of fresh, rain-scented air filled the cabin. Passengers stepped out into light drizzle, blinking at the chaos of sirens and headlights that now felt like salvation. Some kissed the ground. Others simply looked up, at the same sky that had tried to break them, now calm and forgiving. From above, the plane looked small, a single metal shape resting on the wet runway, surrounded by reflections of red and white lights dancing on the surface. A survivor! Later, investigators would replay the black box data, the warnings, the vibrations the moment the engine died, and the calm voices that refused to panic. But no recording would ever capture the silence that followed touchdown. That single, sacred silence between fear and relief. For those on board, that silence meant everything. It was the sound of life, the sound of coming home. As dawn broke fully over the horizon, the clouds drifted apart, and sunlight spilled across the tarmac, washing the world in gold. The damaged aircraft stood still, its left engine charred but its wings strong. Flight 279 had survived, and for everyone who lived that morning, the sky would never look the same again.